Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of like clinical precision.
Right, yeah, like it feels like engineering or something.
Exactly. Like you break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line of the fracture, and the doctor just points at the film and says, well, there it is.
Yeah, it's very visible. It's binary.
And it's comforting, right?
Yeah.
Because we crave things that can be categorized and just fixed with a single clear intervention.
Oh, totally. I mean, it creates this illusion of complete control. We want the world to operate like a simple machine, where one broken gear equals one specific measurable problem.
Right. But then you step into the world of economics, and politics, and how we actually organize human society.
Yeah, and suddenly that X-ray machine is just completely useless.
Completely. We're looking at a landscape that is incredibly murky, where the quote-unquote cure for one problem almost always creates like 3 new diseases.
So, welcome to the deep dive. Today, our mission for you listening is to unpack this really fascinating source document that totally reframes one of the oldest, most fiercely fought debates in human history.
And we are, of course, talking about regulation versus the free market.
Right. But the material we are exploring today, it doesn't approach this like some dry, dusty economic paper filled with dead equations.
No, not at all. It approaches the topic through a highly unique sort of game theory-like lens named Liz.
Yeah, Liz. It treats the entire global economy and our political systems as this massive, ongoing strategic game of power and adaptation and survival.
Which is, frankly, an incredibly refreshing way to look at a debate where people usually just shout past each other.
With bumper sticker slogans, right?
Exactly. It forces us to look at the actual mechanics of power rather than just the stated intentions of politicians.
And before we get into the meat of those mechanics, I do want to establish a very clear baseline for you listening.
Yeah, that's important. Because we are going to be talking about left-wing paradigms, right-wing paradigms, Democrats, Republicans.
All the heavy hitters.
Right. So just to be crystal clear up front, neither of us here at the table are endorsing candidates. We aren't taking sides, and we certainly aren't pushing any political agenda.
Absolutely not.
Our sole purpose today is to just impartially break down the mechanics of these ideas exactly as they are presented in this original source material.
We are just here to explore the structural architecture of how human beings argue over power. We're dissecting the chessboard, basically, not cheering for the white or black pieces.
I love that, dissecting the chessboard. So to set the tone for this whole Liz lens, the material includes this incredibly evocative visual metaphor.
Oh, yeah, it really sticks with you.
It does. I want you to picture this. In the center of the image is a woman with vibrant, almost neon pink hair.
And this is our avatar for Liz.
Right. She is sitting at a table, looking directly at you, and she is positioned right on the fault line of a starkly divided world.
So on our left side, the background is this dynamic, cool blue space.
Yeah, there's a rocket ship blasting off into the clouds. There are chess pieces set up for a complex game. There's an open, winding road.
It clearly represents innovation, strategy, velocity, the free market.
The realm of pure, unconstrained opportunity. The engine, basically.
But then, on her right side, the image shifts completely.
It's bathed in these warm, heavy golden tones.
You see the United States Capitol building, you see the scales of justice, a heavy brass padlock.
And thick metal chains, and a security camera. It represents authority and control, safety and regulation.
And she is sitting there, perfectly balanced between these two extremes, with a slight, sort of knowing smile.
Yeah, she looks like she understands the game being played on both sides of the board. And the text lays out this central paradox immediately.
Right, which is that freedom creates possibility, but it then inevitably invites concentration.
And then regulation restrains that concentration, but it then risks suffocating the possibility.
That paradox is the engine of human history, really. And what is so compelling about this framework is that it immediately moves us away from abstract math. It dives straight into the raw psychology of why human beings choose a side in this tug of war.
Right, because this debate is almost never about pure economics. At its core, it is fundamentally about what specific danger a person is psychologically wired to notice first.
Exactly. Let's really pull that apart, because it explains so much of our political dysfunction.
Okay, let's unpack this. If we look at the pro-regulation mindset, the framework suggests they are reacting to a very specific kind of threat.
They look out at the world and see a landscape where power if left entirely alone, inevitably hardens into hierarchy and exploitation.
They aren't against business
Right.
necessarily.
No, not at all. They are terrified of predation. They look at the mechanics of unchecked markets and they see monopolies cornering a supply chain and crushing small competitors.
And they see extreme information asymmetries.
Right. Like, think about a complex financial product or a pharmaceutical drug. The seller has thousands of hours of research and armies of lawyers.
And the buyer's just, an ordinary person trying to make a choice.
Exactly. The pro-regulation mind sees that massive imbalance and concludes that voluntary exchange in a completely free market is often just an illusion.
I mean, if a single mother is working 3 gig economy jobs just to pay rent, and one of those companies cuts her hourly rate by 20%, she doesn't have the freedom to just walk away and negotiate a better contract.
No, she has to take the hit. To that psychological profile, regulation is not the enemy of freedom.
Regulation is the prerequisite condition that makes freedom actually meaningful for vulnerable people.
Yes, they don't trust concentrated private power to police itself, and historically the evidence for that distrust is massive.
But the pro-market individual is reacting to an entirely different, equally valid primary danger, right?
Oh, absolutely. They see a world where control, if left alone, hardens into stagnation. They fear being trapped by gatekeepers.
They look at arrogant bureaucracies that claim to protect the public, but actually just preserve the status quo and strangle human creativity.
Yeah.
I was trying to think of a way to conceptualize this, and it feels a lot like buying insurance.
Okay, how so?
Well, when you are voting for economic policies, do you fear the hurricane or do you fear the insurance premiums?
Oh, that's a fascinating way to frame it.
Because the hurricane is unfettered corporate greed, a massive shock event, like a financial collapse or a company dumping toxic waste in your town's water supply.
Right.
But the insurance premiums represent that constant, slow, bureaucratic drag.
Yeah.
The taxation, the permitting processes that take 10 years to approve a single bridge.
The endless paperwork that slowly bleeds away your ability to build wealth.
Yeah, both the hurricane and the crushing insurance premiums are completely real, rational threats.
But the problem is that human beings struggle to hold both fears in their head at the same time.
We fall into what this framework calls tunnel vision. Let's map out that tunnel vision. In the regulation camp, their tunnel vision makes them see every single societal problem as absolute proof that the market needs another rule.
They become hyper-attuned to spotting abuse. Their operating system basically boils down to the slogan, if harm exists, regulate.
But the framework points out the massive, fatal flaw in that operating system, which is the unseen costs.
The regulation camp completely ignores the invisible graveyard of things that never
They
happen.
never ask what innovation was killed in the womb because the barrier to entry was set too high.
Right. They don't see the cure for a rare disease that a small biotech startup abandoned because the phase 3 clinical trial compliance costs were mathematically impossible for anyone except a massive pharmaceutical giant to afford.
They only see the immediate, visible harm.
And the market camp has their own exact mirror image of this tunnel vision.
Oh, absolutely. They see every rule as a distortion of natural efficiency, right?
Yeah, they notice bureaucratic friction much faster than they notice human dependency. Their operating system is if a rule exists, remove it.
And their blind spot is structural power dynamics.
They assume that two parties entering into a contract are always on equal footing. They ignore the reality of coercion.
They don't see that when a transnational corporation negotiates with a non-unionized warehouse worker, the concept of a free negotiation is a complete fiction.
It comes down to what our brains are wired to process. We are wired to see immediate, tangible things.
A factory pumping black smoke into the sky is visible. A government agency taking 4 years to stamp a routine building permit is visible.
But lost opportunity is a ghost.
A company that was never founded, a technology that was never developed because the regulatory moat was too wide, that doesn't trigger our threat response.
Which is why the Liz lens advocates for a radical shift in how we ask questions. Instead of looking at a system and asking, is this free or is it regulated?
We need to ask a structural question. What kind of power is growing here and what counterweight exists to keep it from becoming abusive?
That reframes everything. It moves us away from finding a perfect mathematical balance of rules and forces us to look at the mechanics of power.
These psychological blind spots have left massive footprints across human history.
Oh, everywhere. If we test this theory against historical events, we see this brutal ping-pong effect between the two extremes.
The most striking example in the material is the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, it's the ultimate double-edged sword. On one hand, it is the greatest historical argument ever made for the unconstrained free market.
It caused a massive, unprecedented spike in human productivity. We transitioned from agrarian, manual labor to mechanized factories.
It generated immense wealth. It fundamentally transformed the material conditions of humanity.
It proved that removing traditional feudal barriers and allowing capital to aggressively seek efficiency just works miracles.
It unleashed human potential on a scale never before seen.
But it is simultaneously the greatest historical argument for heavy, uncompromising regulation.
Because that exact same unchecked freedom produced horrific systemic exploitation.
Right, we are talking about children working 12-hour shifts in coal mines.
Unspeakable pollution choking the skies of London and Manchester. Slums riddled with cholera, severe, crushing inequality.
The market optimized purely for production, and it just treated human beings as disposable inputs.
It took decades of brutal labor struggles for protections, public health reforms, and environmental regulations to finally catch up to the reality the market had created.
First the expansion, then the correction. We saw the exact same mechanical dynamic in the modern era with the 2008 global financial crisis.
Oh, definitely.
Let's look under the hood of 2008 because the mechanics there are fascinating. Prior to the crash, there was a massive constrained push for financial liberalization.
The prevailing argument was remove the constraints, let the banks innovate with complex instruments like derivatives and collateralized debt obligations, and we will expand the pie for everyone.
And for a while, it worked. Credit flowed freely, homeownership spiked. But the tunnel vision of the free market completely ignored the systemic risk building up in the background.
The market failed to price in the risk because the risk was deliberately obfuscated. You had rating agencies slapping AAA ratings on packages of toxic subprime mortgages.
Because there were no regulatory guardrails demanding transparency or limiting leverage, massive concentrations of toxic debt built up.
The entire system became a house of cards tied together by counterparty risk. When it finally broke, the lack of oversight magnified the collapse, nearly taking down the entire global economy.
It was a pure failure of unchecked market concentration, which naturally leads us to look at how regulation attempts to restore trust after those kinds of catastrophic failures.
The classic U.S. example is the New Deal response to the Great Depression.
Right. After the banks collapsed in the 1930s and wiped out the life savings of ordinary citizens, the government stepped in.
They didn't just tweak the rules, they rebuilt the entire architecture of finance.
They created the FDIC to ensure bank deposits, meaning if your bank failed, the government guaranteed you wouldn't lose everything.
They also enacted the Glass-Steagall Act, which is a perfect example of a structural regulatory mechanism.
It basically built a massive firewall between commercial banking and investment banking.
It said, if you are a bank that takes ordinary people's checking deposits, you cannot use that money to go gamble on the stock market.
The appeal there was obvious. The market had generated sheer panic. The regulation restored trust and provided stability.
But the framework notes that systems evolve. What saved the economy in the 1930s became a massive burden by the 1980s and 90s.
As global finance digitized and became more complex, those old New Deal structures started to look like ancient artifacts.
American banks argued they couldn't compete with European banks that weren't split up by Glass-Steagall.
So the old structures were dismantled in the name of deregulation, which ironically paved the exact road to the 2008 crisis.
It's a pendulum driven entirely by trauma. We get traumatized by stagnation, so we deregulate. Then we get traumatized by exploitation or collapse, so we overregulate.
This perpetual tug-of-war is embodied perfectly by two massive philosophical titans.
Right, Friedrich Hayek and Karl Polanyi. If you want to understand the DNA of this debate, you have to understand their specific warnings.
Hayek is, like, the ultimate voice of suspicion regarding central control.
His core argument isn't just about freedom for freedom's sake, though. It is fundamentally about the transmission of knowledge.
The pricing mechanism. Let's break down how Hayek viewed the price signal, because it's brilliant.
Okay, yeah. So imagine a tin mine in Bolivia suddenly collapses.
Right. Nobody needs to send a memo to a factory manager in China or a consumer in Chicago.
The collapse means less tin is available, so the price of tin naturally goes up.
And because the price goes up, manufacturers realize it's too expensive and they just switch to aluminum.
Exactly. Because they switch, the scarcity is managed. Hayek argued that this price system is a miracle of spontaneous coordination.
It acts like a giant neural network, taking the dispersed, fragmented knowledge of millions of individuals and synthesizing it into a single signal.
The price. He believed that no central planner, no matter how brilliant, no matter how many supercomputers they have, could ever gather enough real-time data to replace that organic mechanism.
Any attempt to centrally plan an economy would inevitably lead to massive inefficiencies.
And eventually, tyranny, because you have to force people to comply with the plan.
So Hayek asks one devastating question. Who knows enough to control this well?
And his answer is nobody.
But then you have Karl Polanyi.
Who looks at that exact same miraculous price mechanism and issues a terrifying sociological warning.
Polanyi argued that treating human life and nature as mere inputs in a mathematical pricing system is deeply destructive.
Polanyi coined the concept of fictitious commodities. He warned that if you organize a society entirely around market principles where labor, land, and money are treated purely as commodities to be bought and sold at market price, you dissolve the essential social fabric that keeps humanity intact.
If labor is just a commodity and the market price of labor drops below the level of basic human survival, the market says, let them starve.
Polanyi warned that transforming a society that has a market economy into a cold, ruthless market society would inevitably trigger a violent political backlash.
So Hayek asks, who knows enough to control this well? But Polanyi asks, what happens to human life when market logic controls too much?
Two massive, intimidating questions. So how do modern systems actually try to navigate between them?
Because we don't live in a pure Hayek world, and we don't live in a pure Polanyi world.
We don't. And if we look globally, the most durable, successful economic systems actually avoid these pure extremes entirely. They deliberately build hybrids.
The framework highlights the East Asian miracle, places like South Korea and Taiwan in the late 20th century.
Their economic ascent was staggering. But they didn't use pure laissez-faire free markets, and they certainly didn't use Soviet-style command economies.
They used outward-oriented, highly competitive markets to generate energy, innovation, and discovery, but they combined that with incredibly heavy, deliberate state intervention.
The state didn't just sit back, they used industrial policy. They picked strategic sectors like shipbuilding, steel, or semiconductors, and subsidized them heavily.
But crucially, they tied those subsidies to strict export performance. If a company didn't compete successfully on the global market, the state cut them off.
So they used the market as an engine to drive performance, but the state held the steering wheel, deciding which direction the economy was going to travel.
Another fascinating hybrid model the text explores is the Nordic pattern, countries like Sweden or Denmark.
The Nordic model is often misunderstood in American political debates. People assume it's pure socialism, but these countries actually have highly competitive, dynamic, deregulated free market economies.
They rank very high on ease of doing business. What makes them unique is how they handle the fallout of that free market.
Right. They don't try to stop the market from disrupting industries. If a Swedish company becomes inefficient, the government lets it die. They embrace creative destruction.
But they buffer the human beings from that destruction through a concept called flexicurity.
They have incredibly strong public institutions, robust unemployment protection, and massive state-funded labor retraining systems.
The state essentially says to the market, you can fire people whenever you need to in order to stay competitive.
Right.
But when you fire them, they fall into our net.
The workforce is continuously retrained and reallocated to newer, more productive sectors. It's a ruthless market economy paired with intense social solidarity.
History isn't just a museum of static snapshots. It's a moving picture.
And what is so compelling about this Liz framework is the claim that this movement between freedom and regulation operates on a highly predictable mechanical timeline.
It's not random. It's an evolutionary life cycle. The framework calls it the phase loop.
This is perhaps the most critical structural insight we are going to cover today. It breaks down the progression of the free market into three terrifyingly predictable phases.
It calls this first arc the seduction.
Phase 1, the explosion. You remove barriers, you deregulate an industry, or maybe a brand new technology is invented.
Like the early internet in the 1990s.
Right. Suddenly, there is no barrier to entry. New players flood in.
Innovation spikes exponentially. Risk-taking is rewarded. Old, bloated monopolies are destroyed.
This is the seductive phase. The free market looks like pure magic. It's a Cambrian explosion of creativity.
But the mechanics of scale guarantee it doesn't stay there. Which brings us to phase 2.
Winners separate. This is the part people don't notice at first. Freedom doesn't just create opportunity, it creates asymmetry.
As companies compete, some inevitably figure out how to scale faster. They accumulate more capital.
And crucially, they build network effects.
Right. If you are building a social media platform or an e-commerce marketplace, the platform with the most users naturally attracts the most creators or sellers,
And once you reach a certain mass, the gravity of your success pulls everyone in, and no one can leave without losing their audience or their customer base.
which leads directly into phase 3. Concentration becomes power.
The winners who separated in phase 2 just stop competing on the actual merits of their products?
They don't need to innovate anymore. They use their vast resources to buy out any potential competitors before they can become a threat.
What economists call killer acquisitions.
Exactly. They set the industry standards. They control the digital infrastructure that everyone else has to use.
And they begin heavily lobbying the government to influence the political rules in their favor.
The sinister twist of phase 3 is that the system is still technically free on paper.
Right, there's no law saying you can't start a competing search engine or a competing massive online retailer.
But functionally, the ecosystem is completely controlled by private power.
Competition plummets, barriers to entry skyrocket naturally, and the public becomes entirely dependent on a few massive monopolies.
It's like an open-world video game, where early on, everyone is discovering things. But eventually, one guild gets all the best loot and effectively dictates how the rest of the server is allowed to play.
That is a perfect analogy. The free market promised decentralization, but it inevitably delivered a corporate oligarchy.
And this exact moment of stagnation and exploitation is when the regulatory impulse violently kicks in.
The public demands intervention. The government steps in to break the power.
But the framework points out that regulation suffers its own identical three-phase cycle of decay.
It calls this arc the betrayal.
Phase 1 of regulation is protection. The government acts as the hero.
Yeah, they step in to reduce the harm, level the playing field, and basically build trust.
Think of the creation of the FDA to stop companies from selling poison medicine, or the early antitrust laws breaking up Standard Oil.
It feels completely necessary, just, and effective.
But then comes phase 2 of regulation, complexity.
The rules start to stack up and interact with each other in unpredictable ways. One rule creates a loophole, so the agency writes 3 more rules to close it.
Compliance costs rise dramatically. The legal and bureaucratic systems thicken into an impenetrable maze.
And ironically, we have to ask, who is best equipped to handle massive compliance costs and armies of lawyers?
The massive corporations.
Right.
The very monopolies the rules were meant to control.
A 10,000-page compliance manual might cost $10 million a year to implement. To a massive tech giant, that's a rounding error.
To a garage startup, it's a death sentence. The little guys drown in the paperwork.
Which leads inevitably to phase 3 of regulation, capture.
This is the phenomenon of regulatory capture.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the large incumbent firms realize that since they are the only ones who can afford to navigate the complex regulations, they can actually use the regulatory apparatus as a weapon.
They hire lobbyists to help write the rules. They ensure the regulations are so incredibly complex and expensive to comply with that no new competitor can ever enter the market.
The regulation morphs from a shield protecting the public into a massive concrete moat protecting the incumbents.
It's a staggering irony. The regulation starts protecting the very monopolies it was created to control.
And this reveals the uncomfortable truth of the entire framework.
The truth is that the real system is never a static binary choice between market or regulation.
The real system is a constant, endless cycle. Creation leads to concentration. Concentration leads to correction via regulation.
That correction inevitably leads to complexity and capture, which results in stagnation.
And that stagnation eventually becomes so intolerable, it leads back to a massive disruption and deregulation, and the loop starts all over again.
So what does this all mean? If this cycle is practically a universal law of structural power like gravity, why do politicians spend billions of dollars every election cycle pretending it's a simple good versus evil choice?
Because nuance and complex cyclical theory don't win elections, but the framework completely unmasks the political facade, particularly in the United States.
It looks past the campaign slogans and analyzes the actual mechanical alignment of the political parties. Let's strip away that facade.
Starting with the Republicans. The Republican Party loudly claims the mantle of the pure free market. Their narrative is all about innovation, entrepreneurship, and getting the government out of the way.
They argue that markets allocate resources infinitely better than the government, and that regulation is inherently inefficient.
But their actual voting record and policy platforms reveal a massive contradiction. They are not purely free market at all.
They selectively support massive state interventions when it suits their cultural or national priorities.
They frequently champion heavy trade protectionism and tariffs. A tariff is the ultimate anti-free market tool. It is the government artificially raising the price of foreign goods to protect domestic industries.
They push for restrictions on industries they feel are culturally hostile to them. They support heavy government involvement in border control and defense spending.
So their real unstated stance isn't free markets. It's free markets for economic growth, but aggressive state control to protect our national and cultural identity.
And the Democratic Party has a similar, perfectly mirroring facade.
The Democrats lean heavily into the rhetoric of regulation and state control. Their narrative is that unchecked markets produce rampant inequality, environmental destruction, and instability.
The government is viewed as the essential moral tool for fairness, consumer protection, and worker rights.
But again, they are not pure regulators. They rely entirely on capitalist structures to fund their agenda. They champion market competition.
They eagerly hand out massive government subsidies to spur private market innovation in favored sectors, like green energy or semiconductor manufacturing.
So the Democratic real stance is regulated markets with a strong safety net. But we absolutely need the capitalist engine running at full speed to generate the tax revenue.
And the framework highlights something truly fascinating. Despite all the performative outrage on cable news, these two sides secretly agree on a surprising amount of structural policy right now.
The document lists 4 specific areas where the supposed binary completely collapses. First is antitrust.
Suddenly, both sides hate big tech monopolies, but they hate them for totally different reasons.
The Democrats view big tech through the lens of economic dominance. They want to break them up because they have too much market share, they are crushing small competitors, and they hold too much power over labor.
The Republicans view big tech through the lens of cultural and informational control. They want to break them up or regulate them because they fear ideological censorship and bias.
It's the exact same target, concentrated corporate power, but attacked via completely different justifications.
The second area of secret agreement is industrial policy. Both parties are actively supporting the government, pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into specific private industries.
Whether it's the GPS Act for semiconductors or infrastructure bills, that is not pure free market capitalism.
That is strategic state intervention to ensure national competitiveness against global rivals like China.
The third area is trade skepticism. The era of both parties blindly championing pure, globalized free trade is dead.
Both sides have embraced tariffs, the reshoring of manufacturing, and securing domestic supply chains.
They have both collectively decided that national resilience and industrial capacity are more important than theoretical market efficiency.
And the fourth is crisis response. When the system truly breaks, like in the 2008 financial crash or the 2020 COVID pandemic, ideology evaporates instantly.
Both parties voted to print trillions of dollars, inject money directly into private markets, stabilize failing banks, and massively expand government power to prevent a total collapse.
When the house is on fire, nobody argues about the water bill.
Which leads to a piercing insight about the real divide in American politics. The framework argues that the parties aren't actually arguing over whether power concentrates.
Anyone with eyes can see that power has already concentrated in massive transnational corporations and massive government administrative agencies.
So what are they arguing over?
They are arguing over who should be trusted with that concentrated power.
Exactly. The Republican worldview, generally speaking, trusts private actors and corporate leaders slightly more than it trusts government bureaucrats.
They view the state as the ultimate, inescapable monopoly backed by the threat of violence.
The Democratic worldview trusts government institutions and democratic processes slightly more than it trusts private corporations.
They view unaccountable corporate boards as predatory entities driven solely by profit at the expense of human life.
But aren't those coalitions incredibly fractured? You've got pro-regulation Republicans and pro-market Democrats.
You are absolutely right, and the material maps out these internal factions to show that identity over policy drives the polarization.
Within the Republican Party, you have libertarians who despise all regulation and genuinely want pure free markets. But you also have populists who are deeply anti-corporate.
They hate big banks and want the government to intervene aggressively to protect the working class from globalization.
Within the Democratic Party, you have progressives who want massive wealth redistribution and strict punitive regulation.
But you also have moderates and technocrats who are highly market-friendly and just want to optimize the capitalist system with smart tweaks.
So the boundaries are completely permeable. A populist Republican and a progressive Democrat might actually completely agree that a giant Wall Street bank needs to be broken up.
Even if they disagree on literally every other cultural issue, which implies that the massive polarization we feel in society isn't really about structural policy at all. It's about identity.
The debate over market versus regulation has become fused with cultural identity, geography, and media diet.
People aren't asking what specific regulatory mechanism works best to prevent the Phase 3 stagnation cycle.
They are asking, which tribe am I aligned with in the broader culture war? And that tribalism completely masks the underlying structural arguments.
And this underlying argument, who do we trust with power, isn't just about economics.
Yeah.
It actually bleeds into every single facet of human society.
Yes. The source provides a matrix of 9 dimensions to prove that the free market versus regulation debate is just one manifestation of a much deeper human struggle.
It's basically a comprehensive map of every argument you've ever had at Thanksgiving dinner. The list includes individual versus collective, idealism versus pragmatism, security versus privacy,
Globalism versus nationalism, stability versus change, freedom versus authority.
equality versus merit, centralization versus decentralization, and tradition versus progress. Let's really dive deep into a few of these because the mechanics of how they overlap are fascinating.
Let's start with security versus privacy. How does that map onto the market and regulation tension?
Well, it maps perfectly if you look at the mechanics of control. Regulation basically aligns with security.
Because to enforce a regulation, to ensure safety and compliance, the governing body requires visibility. It requires oversight, monitoring, reporting, and data collection.
You cannot regulate a system that you cannot see. And the free market, conceptually, aligns with privacy.
It demands less centralized control, less reporting, and more opacity and autonomy for the individual actor.
But the paradox exists here too, especially in the modern tech era.
Exactly, because free markets can aggressively exploit privacy. Think about surveillance capitalism.
Corporations harvest immense amounts of deeply personal data through completely voluntary market transactions to build behavioral profiles and manipulate consumer habits.
So the unconstrained market completely erodes privacy. Conversely, governments can radically overreach in the name of safety.
Demanding backdoors to encryption, mass surveillance, or sweeping financial reporting to ensure security.
Protection requires visibility, which destroys privacy. Freedom requires opacity, which destroys security.
Let's look at another dimension, centralization versus decentralization. This one is incredibly tricky.
This one contains a built-in trap. Conceptually, the free market represents the ultimate decentralization. Millions of independent actors making billions of individual choices every single day.
Coordinating through the price mechanism. Regulation represents centralization, a single governing body in a capital city writing rules that apply unilaterally to everyone.
But the phase loop we talked about earlier completely subverts this.
Because, as we established, free markets often naturally evolve into hyper-centralized power structures.
A decentralized market produces a winner, and that winner becomes a massive tech platform that acts as a private, centralized government over its sector.
They start decentralized but end up completely centralized. On the flip side, regulation is enacted centrally by the government.
But its stated goal, like aggressive antitrust enforcement, is often to force the market to re-decentralize.
The central power is used to smash the concentrated private power into smaller, decentralized pieces.
So markets start decentralized and inevitably become centralized. Regulation starts centralized and tries to brutally force decentralization back onto the market.
It's a snake eating its own tail. Let's examine equality versus merit.
The free market is inherently aligned with merit, or at least market value. It rewards performance, efficiency, innovation, and competitive advantage.
It does not care about your intentions, it cares about your output. Regulation leans heavily toward equality.
It seeks to correct disparate outcomes, redistribute wealth through progressive taxation, and ensure a baseline standard of living regardless of an individual's market value.
And the uncomfortable mechanical truth here.
The uncomfortable truth is the Pareto principle. Pure merit, over time, inevitably generates massive compounding inequality.
The winners don't just win once, their advantages compound generationally. Wealth creates wealth.
But pure equality, enforced by heavy regulation, inevitably reduces differentiation and destroys the incentive to excel or take massive risks.
If the reward for innovation is confiscated to ensure equality, you lose the engine of progress. Let's do one more of it. Tradition versus progress.
The market is often championed by conservatives who love tradition. But the market is actually the greatest destroyer of tradition in human history.
Yes, the market is an engine of pure creative destruction. It optimizes for efficiency, and efficiency does not care about your local main street, your family structure, or your historical way of life.
The free market will gut a manufacturing town and move the jobs overseas without a second thought if it saves 3 cents on the dollar.
Regulation, on the other hand, is often used to preserve tradition. Zoning laws preserve the historical character of a neighborhood. Tariffs preserve traditional industries.
Here's where it gets really interesting. If you look at all 9 of these dimensions, they all boil down to one master switch.
Do you trust distributed organic systems, or do you trust coordinated intentional control?
That is the master switch of human governance. Every system that maximizes distributed organic freedom will eventually concentrate power.
And every system that attempts to intentionally control power will eventually constrain freedom and cause stagnation.
It is an inescapable law of social physics.
With the full scope of the problem laid bare across history, politics, and philosophy, the ultimate question is, how do we actually fix this?
If the cycle of stagnation and concentration is inevitable, how do we design a system that survives it?
We need the Liz strategy, designing for continuous reset.
The framework provides a very specific mechanical strategy, but it requires emphatically correcting a massive public misconception first.
When people hear about this pendulum swinging between market and regulation, they assume the goal of a good government is to find the perfect 50-50 balance.
A static midpoint where we have exactly the right amount of freedom and exactly the right amount of rules.
Like perfectly balancing a seesaw and just hovering there forever.
But the text argues that is entirely wrong. There is no stable, perfect balance. The goal is not balance, the goal is movement.
Think of it like riding a bicycle. You don't stay upright by balancing perfectly still. You stay upright by continuously pedaling and shifting your weight.
The Liz perspective dictates that you must keep power moving at all times to prevent it from settling and becoming permanent.
Free to compete, controlled to concentrate. That is the core design rule.
Maximize freedom at the edges to allow entry, and apply aggressive control at the peaks when power becomes dominant.
What does that actually look like in practice? The material breaks it down into a highly specific 3-stage playbook. Let's walk through the early stage.
In the early stage of a new industry or a new technology, think the early days of the internet or the current chaotic dawn of artificial intelligence, the strategy demands a massive bias toward freedom.
You want incredibly low barriers to entry. You want minimal, almost non-existent regulation.
You want to encourage wild, messy, dangerous experimentation.
Because we need the innovation, and we don't even know what the technology is capable of yet.
Exactly. This is the incubation phase where alternatives are born. At this stage, power has not yet concentrated.
If you apply heavy regulation here, if you demand massive compliance costs, safety audits, and licensing before anyone even knows what the product is, you kill the future before it exists.
You freeze the game before the pieces are even on the board. Over-regulating here kills the future.
Okay, so the industry grows up a bit. We enter the growth stage. What is the mechanical playbook now?
Now you introduce very light guardrails. The winners are starting to emerge. Market share is consolidating slightly.
At this point, the regulation should not be about stopping success or dictating how the product is made.
It should be strictly about basic transparency, preventing outright fraud, and establishing liability. You aren't managing the market, you're just keeping the playing field visible so consumers aren't being deceived.
But eventually, as the phase loop dictates, the market reaches the dominant stage. Network effects lock in.
Yes. A few massive players now control the entire system. Barriers to entry for newcomers have naturally skyrocketed because they simply cannot compete with the scale and data advantage of the incumbents.
The public is now entirely dependent on these monopolies. So what does the Liz playbook say to do at this specific moment?
Bring the hammer down. This is the stage for heavy, aggressive, uncompromising regulation.
Vigorous antitrust enforcement. Breaking up conglomerates. Banning platforms from self-preferencing their own products over third-party sellers.
And here is the absolute genius of the framing at this specific dominant stage. Heavy regulation is actually pro-market.
Stop right there, because this is the most counterintuitive, brilliant point in the whole framework. Explain how using massive state power to destroy a company is pro-market.
Because by phase 3, the incumbent monopolies have effectively destroyed the free market anyway. They have killed competition, bought out the innovators, and built massive walls.
The market is dead. It's a corporate fiefdom. So by using state power to break them up and strip away their concentrated advantages, The regulation is artificially restoring the competitive conditions of the early market.
It's forcing the system to reset back to phase one.
It uses government power not to micromanage the economy forever, but to smash the dam and let the river flow again.
The state breaks the monopoly so that the free market can breathe again.
So the golden rule here is to regulate the outcomes of power, not the process of creation.
Exactly. Don't micromanage how engineers build a new platform in a garage. Let them build.
But the moment that platform becomes the inescapable infrastructure for global communication and commerce, and they start using that power to crush rivals, you regulate them heavily.
And the framework uses this exact model to explain the core structural failure of the United States system.
It says the U.S. actually gets the first part right. We start very free. Our culture embraces risk, which is why we generate so much incredible technology and venture capital.
But then the timing completely falls apart.
Because we wait far too long to regulate during the growth and dominance stages.
We wait decades. The political system gets paralyzed, largely because of the intense lobbying efforts of the very companies that are entering phase 3 dominance.
Lawmakers don't understand the technology, so they do nothing. And then, when a massive crisis finally forces the government's hand, like a financial collapse or massive data scandal, they panic.
And they regulate inconsistently or poorly. The timing is completely out of sync with the natural life cycle of the power.
This is exactly why we get entrenched tech dominance, wild financial boom and bust cycles, and massively distorted, captured markets like healthcare.
The interventions are happening at the entirely wrong moments in the cycle.
It's like applying fertilizer to a fully grown, invasive weed and then spraying weed killer on a tiny, struggling seedling. The timing is everything.
Which brings us to the ultimate conclusion of this document. The final, cutting insight from this entire Liz lens.
The framework concludes that the real enemy of human flourishing is not regulation, and the real enemy is certainly not the free market.
The enemy is permanent power.
Permanent, untouchable power.
Whether that power takes a form of an unaccountable, bloated government bureaucracy that you can never vote out and that refuses to adapt.
Or a massive, monopolistic transnational corporation that controls your data, dictates your choices, and bends the laws to its will.
Any power that successfully stops the cycle of disruption and entrenches itself forever is the ultimate enemy.
The goal of society is simply maintenance. Continuous, exhausting, absolutely necessary maintenance against power's innate gravitational tendency to concentrate.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today.
We really have. We started with the deeply ingrained psychological fears that drive our tribal political voting, the terror of exploitation versus the dread of stagnation.
We traced the historical ping-pong of the Industrial Revolution and the intricate mechanics of the 2008 financial crash.
We broke down the terrifyingly inevitable phase loop, where organic freedom always turns into concentration, and well-intentioned regulation always decays into capture.
We explored the deep philosophical tensions of privacy, merit, and decentralization.
And finally, we unpacked a strategic playbook for how to weaponize both market forces and state intervention at precisely the right moments to keep society dynamic and prevent anyone from becoming untouchable.
It is a profound structural reframing. It completely invalidates the simplistic binary talking points we are fed every single day on the news.
It asks us to look at the gears of the machine rather than the paint job.
It really does.
But as we wrap up, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought. Something that builds on this framework, but pushes it into the near future.
Okay, let's hear it.
We've established that human history is basically just a slow, clunky, often deeply traumatic cycle of reacting to concentrated corporate power with delayed, captured government regulations.
A very slow, highly inefficient feedback loop.
Right. But what happens when artificial intelligence fully enters this dynamic?
Oh, wow.
If the core problem is that human bureaucracies are too slow to recognize the phase 3 concentration of power, what if an advanced AI system could process global market data, supply chains, pricing mechanisms, and structural power dynamics in real time?
Could we one day see the development of smart regulation, a system that dynamically adjusts on the fly?
Imagine an AI regulator that tightens antitrust scrutiny around a creeping monopoly by the millisecond, while instantly dissolving bureaucratic barriers and fast-tracking permits for a brand new startup in the exact same sector.
That is a staggering concept. Real-time algorithmic balancing of the phase loop. It would eliminate the lag time that causes so much of our societal trauma.
But the paradox remains. If we hand over the master switch of our global economy to an AI regulator, to perfectly balance freedom and control, would that AI simply become the ultimate, unbreakable permanent power?
Are we just building the final, unchallengeable bureaucracy to save us from ourselves?
Does the AI solve the paradox of power, or does it simply become the final, permanent apex predator on the game board?
That is a chilling thought.
Something to mull over the next time you see a politician arguing about the free market on television. The diagnostic landscape of human power isn't an X-ray. It's a living, breathing cycle.
Keep your eyes open to the unseen costs. Watch out for your own tunnel vision.
And keep questioning the structures around you. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.